Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining our diagnostic training session today. And what you're about to see is a pre-recorded training session we did over in the United States. But be assured that a lot of the material that we cover is really applicable to any automotive application. So just be aware that yes, it is a lot of North American vehicles, but they will apply a lot of the same principles apply over in the UK as well. Now, if you do have any questions, if you're watching this during the premiere, you can just leave it in the chat. We'll be monitoring live chat. If you're watching this after the premiere, then just feel free to leave a comment underneath the video and we'll get to those as we can as well. So my name is Jason Gabrenas. I'm one of Snap-on's diagnostic technical trainers. I've been in the training department since 2013, traveling around North America, helping techs and shop owners get the most out of their diagnostic equipment. Before I did that, it was a couple years as a diagnostic sales rep at Snap-on, so I had 30 different franchisees I worked with, as well as the shops that they serviced, in order to help everyone get the most out of their diagnostic needs. Then before I did that, it was 8 years at Subaru, so I worked in a dealership, and over time, I guess, just became the default diag guy in the shops. I always ended up having the drivability problems, the intermittent problems, the weird wiring problems that would show up on those cars. And that's really where I cut my diagnostic teeth, was trying to figure out all those weird head scratcher type cars that would come into my bed. Then before that, a bunch of other miscellaneous wrenching jobs. Been a little over 25 years under hood experience for me. Our topic today is the power of OBD2 information. And there is so much power in this information that we had to divide it into a two-part class. So this is part one. We'll take you up through the history and the first few modes of OBD. And then next week, we will take over and do part two. So with this information, OBD2, we're going to discuss the history here first, and then we'll talk about some of the differences between OEM and OBD2 generic type information, as well as, like I said, a couple of the modes. So if we go way back and way back in the first beginning of diagnostics in automobiles, we're right at the beginning of the 1980s. The first diagnostic tool some of us ever used was that paper clip. Take the paper clip, you bend it in such a way where you can short two pins and count the number of flashes on the dashboard. And hopefully you counted them correctly. It's a 23, not a 32 that you were counting, and make sure you don't get the flashes mixed up. Otherwise, you could be diagnosing something completely different than what you think. As I said, way back in 1981, GM introduced the ALDL connector. So that was one of the very first onboard diagnostic connectors used in the industry. So ALDL, for those of you who like trivia, it's assembly line diagnostic link connector. That was going on for a few years. Other manufacturers started doing some stuff. And then 1988 CARB, which is the California Air Resource Board, required some OBD capability on all 1988 and newer vehicles. So 1988 model year, if you had a vehicle in North America, you had to have some sort of diagnostic capability. Now, it could be a lot of things, and the connector could be whatever the manufacturer decided it needed to be. And granted, cars weren't all that complex back then. So what did we need? We needed a few data PIDs and maybe a way to retrieve some codes. But hey, they said you need to do this, and that was the end of the 80s. And then 1996, OBD2 became mandatory on all the vehicles in the US. So OBD2 really standardized everything, because before that it was kind of like the Wild West. So we had multiple different manufacturers and multiple different ways of doing things, multiple different connectors. So you had to have a lot of tooling in order to even go through that. 2001, EOBD became mandatory in all gasoline vehicles in Europe, and diesel was added mandatory in 2004. So they lagged a little bit behind, and you'll see that over here in the States, where you may have some vehicles with multiple connectors on them. They'll have an OBD2 connector and like maybe a round factory connector under the hood. And then in 2008, at least in the US, CAN communication was required at the connector as well. So you had to have pin 6 and 14. And you had to have all the major modules on that CAN bus, and that was kind of one of the last major standards, I guess, if you think about it that way. Back in 08, so that's what, 15 years ago still. So we have been mandatory with OBD2 in the States since what, 27 years. 27 years, I think that would be right. Yeah, 27 years. So that's a long time. That's a very long time. Could be longer than some of you have been around, but definitely helpful, because back in the day, we had, like I said, a smorgasbord of connectors. So we have the ALDL we talked about earlier, the GM, Ford one, Chrysler one. This is the one off the BMW, the 20 pin. This one's off the Mercedes, the 38 pin, I think it was. This one's off a Nissan. It was actually mounted in the fuse box. This one's under the hood. This one's under the hood. That one could be under the dash, you know, kind of wherever they tend to be. This one's off Subaru, so that'd be the first one I really dealt with in the dealership, and that could have been one of like 3 or 4 different places underneath the dash. And then this one's from a Honda as well, and you can see that's kind of, looks like it's kind of in the dash there maybe, but it's got a lot of different pins, a lot of different pin configurations depending on what the manufacturer decided. So that meant back then, at least to work on those cars, because you can still work on them today, even now. So back then and through now, we need a drawer full of connectors in order to hook up to these vehicles. So just depending on what you needed, that one looks like it fits that Honda there, right? Bunch of other manufacturers. Jeep had a different one. This one's kind of a universal one where you put the pins in different places. Of course, you need an adapter to adapt it to the scan tool. In some cases, it was a cable on the older ones. On the newer ones, it is just a 16 pin OBD2 adapter to the 15 pin on the other side. And then you're able to communicate with the vehicle that way. So there's a lot of different manufacturer differences. And that's what OBD2 helped us with. One of the things, because OBD2 was going to be this great savior, going to help us fix cars easier, better. Not always the case, I don't think, but at least one thing it did make easier was we're going to standardize some stuff. We're going to standardize the pins. And we're going to standardize the connector. So one nice thing, so pin 16 always, no matter what, if it's an OBD2 compatible vehicle, pin 16 should have battery power as long as the fuse is good. Pins 4 and 5 are always ground. Pin 2 is going to be for J1850 variable pulse width, or we'll use pin 2 and 10 for J1850 pulse width modulated. 6 and 14 is going to be CAN. 7 is going to be for K-line keyword. And then pin 15 will be for the keyword L line. And then all the other ones can be used at the manufacturer's discretion, whatever that happens to be. I know something like on a lot of GM, like Global A cars, 2010s and newer, they'll use the main CAN line, then they'll put another CAN line on these 2 pins, another CAN line on these 2 pins, and maybe something else on these 2 pins. They split them up into all these different buses because they have so many modules on these vehicles, they need a different way to communicate. And then you also had like the late 90s, early 2000s, if I back up real quick, late 90s, early 2000s, like the Mercedes, the BMW, they had the round connector and the OBD2 connector. So it's which connector do I need to use depending on what type of data, what type of information I need. And then we get to talk about the Mitsubishi too, the late 90s Mitsubishis, where you had to use the factory plug and the OBD2 plug at the same time, and there were some adapters that you needed for that as well. So standardization really helped the technician. I only needed one cable, I just needed to plug in, and then the tool needed to be able to figure out how it's communicating. Now, you may have heard me speak before about how I like to think of a computer as a house. You're going to have a front door, and you're going to have a back door. Now, what I don't talk about a lot is that inside that house, there's 2 rooms. 2 doors, 2 rooms. Coming in the input side is going to be my coolant temp sensor, oxygen sensor, NOx sensor, all the inputs going to go into the computer. Then it's going to process them. Now it has 2 different ways of processing them. It has the OEM VIN specific side, which you would get through on a snap-on tool going through scanner, and that gets you to the VIN specific side. And it also has the generic side, which is the OBD2 side. And we got to that one through the OBD direct. There's also a way to get through scanner. I'll show you in a little bit. But you could feasibly scan a car, and I've seen this many times. If you saw my live stream last week, it happened. If you scan a car, there may be different codes on both sides. There's certainly different code definitions because the manufacturer can call a P0102 one thing, and then OBD generic is going to be a standardized. Here's what a P0102 is, for example. There's different thresholds that need to be met to set a code on either side as well. The manufacturer can set it to pretty much wherever they want. On the generic side, it has to be a set threshold based on OBD2 standards. So there may be more codes on this side and fewer codes on this side, or vice versa. There could be more codes on this side and less on this side. Sometimes they'll match, sometimes they don't. So it's just kind of a matter of how the manufacturer processes the information. Also, data may be different. So the data on this side could possibly have substitute values. The data on this side will not have substitute values. So some differences in between the two different sides. So we just have to be cognizant of that when we're checking cars, scanning them, diagnosing them, just to understand that there are differences per side. So if we were to go into the scan tool and simply to get there, we just go into OBD Direct. Like I said, we're going to go on that generic side. We'll just go into that OBD Direct. And then on Snap-on tools anyways, we're going to have OBD Diagnose, which is how you actually get into the car. OBD Health Check, which is going to run a quick health check, kind of like a code scan, but for OBD generic. And there's also an OBD training mode, which can come in handy if you want to learn more about OBD2 and how it works and how it's going to present itself to you on the tool. Just pop into OBD training mode. It's just like the demo vehicle we have on the OEM specific side. This is just on the generic side. So you don't have to be connected to a car. You can do it anywhere as long as you have the tool in front of you. But in this case, we'll go into OBD Diagnose, and we're just going to pop in and see what we can see. Now, if we want to start communication with the vehicle, start communication is where we'll go. Next one's connector information. So as I said before, connectors can be in odd spots sometimes, especially early on in OBD2. Not all the manufacturers put them where they kind of were supposed to be. It was kind of vague, so it should be in this distance of the steering wheel on the driver's side. Well, on a Honda, it could be in the ashtray. It could be in the center console. So there is some connector information that tells you kind of where it's located. Sometimes it's behind like a panel or something you got to pop off. And then manual protocol selection is used for if I know the protocol I want to communicate with the vehicle with, I can choose from a list and just choose it from there. This can also be helpful if you have not a car, maybe like a boat, something like that, that maybe it would carry OBD2, it would have the same protocol as the OBD2 vehicle, has an OBD2 port, but I'm just going to tell it, I don't know what kind of year, make, model the engine would be, so I would just go under manual protocol, link to it, and at least be able to get OBD2 information. We can do it that way as well. In this case, we'll go to start communication. And then you see we have all the information. So we have our readiness monitors, check engine light status, troubleshooter, which we'll talk about in a little bit. That's very handy. And then all of our 10 modes of OBD. Now, one thing I will mention is you may see different things down here, depending on the vehicle. I think it really depends on the age of the vehicle. There were some changes that were made through the years. So on an older vehicle, you might see mode 5, 6, 7. On newer vehicles, you might just see 6 and 7 because I think they kind of rolled some of that mode 5 stuff into mode 6. You may see more than a couple mode 9s. You may or may not see mode 10 depending on the age of the vehicle. So just be aware that the screen may look a little bit different depending on the vehicle. Yes, it is supposed to be generic, but changes happen throughout the industry, throughout the years. So it's going to communicate with whatever the car is going to throw back at. The first one there is readiness monitor. So this is helpful, especially if I'm doing an emissions inspection. I want to see if my monitors are complete because to pass an emissions inspection, you need to have your monitors passed, right? So you can do monitors complete since the code was cleared, or monitors complete this drive cycle. So whatever you want to learn, go in there, and then it's just going to come up in a format just like our data stream. It's going to say whether or not it's completed and whether or not it's supported. So in this case, AC system refrigerant test is not supported on this vehicle. So just be aware that if it's not supported, it's not supported. The vehicle just doesn't have it. And if it's complete, that's good. If it's not complete, then it needs to run under whatever drive cycle conditions to get you there. MIL status, that's a malfunction indicator lamp. It's going to be on or off. That could be useful, I suppose, if the bulb had been tampered with, taken out. some other situation. I want to see, is it requesting the malfunction indicator lamp on, and maybe the bulb's burned out or something like that. I don't know. But we can double check that real quick and see if it is commanding a light on and it's not. Troubleshooter on Snap-on Scan Tools. So this is exclusive to Snap-on Tools. But if we go in here, we have Engine Troubleshooter. And it's things like code tips, parameter descriptions, which I think are pretty cool, guidelines and procedures, and help. So under code tips, we have basic general tips on here's what the code means. Here's some possible things it could be when you have a problem. So it's going to be B, C, P, and U codes, and then just whatever the first number is, just select the list and it'll show you the list. Next one's parameter description. So this is very helpful because I get questions, what is this PID supposed to be? What's good for this PID? What is a good range for this PID? It's going to give you a lot of examples in here. It's of course not everything, but it's going to give you a lot of the more common examples like fuel trims and coolant temperatures and things like that. So if you just select one, I just select the first one. It says for the oxygen sensor voltage bank 1 sensor 1, expected reading with the engine cold, open loop will be 0.45 volts and no switching. Engine hot, closed loop, 0.2 to 0.8 volts switching once per second. So that's just the cycling zirconia oxygen sensor. Read this data stream in conjunction with fuel trim data for further indication of history. Check mode 10 for airflow rate. Mass air sensor that is reading faulty could command that ECU leans the mixture out, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. You can read through it when you want because, like I said, this is on the tool. If you just go into OBD training mode and then pop in here, you can read through any of those at your leisure, whatever you would like. Next one's guidelines and procedures, things like talking about the different diagnostic services, and then modes 1 through 10 or service 1 through 10, depending on, I guess they can be called the same either way, service 10 or mode 10. A couple different workflow examples as well. And then help will give you information on 5-digit OBD2 codes, how do they structure a code, readiness monitors, generic drive cycle, and abbreviations. Lots of good information within that troubleshooter. Now let's talk through the different modes. So first one off is mode 1. So that's going to give us access to diagnostic data such as inputs, outputs, and status. So one key component of this is all the values are current values. So here's what's being measured by the computer. No substitute values are allowed. Some manufacturers, depending on what the issue is with the vehicle, it may add substitute values to keep it running down the road. In the case of OBD generic data, you will not have that. So it'll just be whatever the current value is, that's what it is. There's no substitutes allowed. Can also be referred to as serial data. So you may have heard of it that way. So if we just pop into mode 1 there, and we can see there's just there's our data there. So accelerator pedal, relative throttle position, engine speed, etc., and seeing what it's doing. Mode 2 gives us access to freeze frame data. So what freeze frame data is going to be mode 1 data that we just looked at, and whatever it was doing at the time of the fault, like a snapshot. Right? So it'll take a picture of that data at the time of the fault. Once again, since it's pulling from mode 1, all the data is actual values. No substitute values are allowed in there either. Freeze frame can be used to duplicate vehicle conditions for diagnosis. So I know as a technician, when it had this failure, was it running for an hour? Was it at first startup? Was it cold? Was it hot? Was it idle? Was it at 2000 RPM? What was going on with the vehicle when the error occurred? So freeze frame can be very helpful when it comes to that. So once again, we pop in here, go to mode 2, and then in there would be our freeze frame information as well. Here's what happened when it failed. Mode 3 is going to be pulling our DTCs. So this will display our emissions related DTCs, and it's going to identify faults using specific criteria. And as I said, criteria on OBD2 could be different than what the criteria the manufacturer sets. So we need to check both sides. A couple easy ways to do that, or we can do it manually. So specific criteria such as the signal or component is short to ground, or the signal or component is short to battery, or no signal, or the component has an open circuit. So it'll give us some of those criteria along with the code. So we'll pop in there, and you would see we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different trouble codes in this particular vehicle, and it is going to give us just our generic code description. Like I said before, manufacturer descriptions may differ slightly from this, just because they reword them. They're allowed to do that on their own side. But on this side, it has to be a generalized code description. Now, also, you may notice I'm running this on a Zeus and screenshots off of Zeus, and I don't have any of that diagnose button over there like I would have for Fast Track Intelligent Diagnostics. And that is because Fast Track Intelligent Diagnostics needs to access year, make, model on a vehicle in order for it to pull down the data. Since it's just general, we don't have an actual vehicle loaded in here. It's just generic data. It's not going to provide that information. Just so you know, you have to go into vehicle VIN specific mode to do that. And then mode 4 is going to be the last one we're going to talk about this week before we move on to live on the tool. We'll talk about the rest of them next week. But mode 4 is clears the emissions related diagnostic data. Now you have to be aware of this, that it's not going to just clear the codes, it clears everything. So it's going to clear all DTCs, it's going to freeze any of the clear any of the freeze frame data. So if you had not gotten to that freeze frame data already, it is going to wipe that out too. So make sure you look at that. O2 sensor monitoring results, any of the readiness monitors get reset, and any of the onboard tests get reset as well. Basically just wipes it out, starts back fresh. The one thing that will not clear with mode 4, and no matter what you do with no matter what tool you use, doesn't matter, any permanent codes. We'll talk more about those in the next section, but permanent codes would be mode 10. And those are codes that are going to sit there until the computer passes the test that would set that code. So you can't clear it. Disconnect the battery is not going to clear it. Nothing clears it except for the computer passing the test or the monitor passing. So you can go in there, mode 4. It's going to say, hey, do you want to clear the emission, clear the diagnostic data? Here's everything it's going to clear. So make sure you're sure. You would hit continue, and then it would clear. All right, let's go live on the tool and see a couple things. So the first thing I do want to mention is let's go into the scanner room. And I want to pull up my little Chrysler demo. It's going to auto ID it. And I remember how I told you we can kind of go back and forth and we can look at information on both sides. This is how we're going to do it. Just have to let it ID there. There we go. It's going to look for fitted systems because it's a Chrysler and that has that option. Okay, and then if I go in and do a code scan, what it's going to do, I'll just do a pre-scan. It's going to check, of course, the engine, transmission, all the different modules on the vehicle. Now, this is a simulator board. It's like a little Chrysler board. It's kind of like the BMW board you may have seen me use before for scope. But it's going to go through it. Of course, it's going to find modules that aren't there. So it's going to have random codes set in there, which is fine. We're not really worried about this. I would like you to note that there are no codes in the engine control module. Now, when it says engine here on this screen, that means the OEM side, the VIN specific side of the computer by the OEM. That's the side that we're on for engine. Nothing in transmission, ABS, airbag. Like I said, we're going to get some random codes because the modules technically aren't there because it's just a simulator board. So it's got like engine, transmission, ECM, TCM, and a let's see, the TIPM. It's got a body control module in there too. So almost there. It's around 20-ish, 19 or 20, 18, I guess. All right, so engine, no codes. If I scroll down though, we get to OBD2 codes. Notice how it has 4 codes in the OBD2 side, mode 3. And then also the permanent codes in a real vehicle. These should be probably duplicated down here, but once again, simulator board, but that's mode 10. That's our permanent codes. So on a code scan, on a full vehicle scan, it will check the OEM side, checks the OBD2 side, and it checks for permanent codes as well. So since I'm actually in the car and I have a car loaded, I could hit diagnose and then go into Fast Track Intelligent Diagnostics and do it. Just so you're aware. And then if I wanted to go into the engine module proper, and I could look at codes and data, etc. But there's also this generic functions button. So if I go in there, you see it's almost everything that we had on the OBD2 side when we were looking at the slides. So we can look at readiness monitors, mode 2, 3, 4, 6, etc. So there's a couple modes missing. So this isn't the full generic side. We won't have data. You won't have mode 10 in here, but you'll have access to most of the modes in here. Now, if I want to go down and go to the OBD direct side manually, I'll just pop back out of the car, go into OBD direct, go to diagnose. Yes, I want to scan a real vehicle. We have start communication, connector information, and manual protocol. So like I said, manual protocol. It's going to say using unsupported communication protocols may activate warning lights and set faults. And then I could just choose whatever I want to speak to the vehicle, depending on what it uses. Connector information, like I said, if we had a vehicle that comes in and I don't necessarily know where it is, like maybe a Lamborghini. Connectors on the left side, center console. Good to know. And then it's going to ask you, do you want to start a communication session with this vehicle? I'm going to say no. You see all the different brands in here, things like Donkervoort, Rolls-Royce, Maserati, all the different, because you can communicate with any vehicle as long as it's OBD2. You can communicate with it using the scan tool, right? Just want to have OEM specific side. So let's start communication. It's going to auto detect. Notice how it does 12 volt and 24 volt vehicles as well. It's going to say it found one vehicle. It's communicating over CAN. There's the VIN. Hit continue. And then now we're in the actual simulated vehicles. Readiness monitors. Monitors complete. It's going to come through and say, okay, what's complete, what's not complete, what's supported or not. Going through the different functions there. Status, troubleshooter again. Like I said, we got code tips. So if I wanted to pick a P0102, which is a mass airflow problem, mass or volume airflow sensor, A circuit low. So in the engine control module, the output from the mass airflow sensor is not as expected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It tells you how it works. Possible causes for this is right here. So it gives you, here's the code description, here's why it sets, and here's what it possibly could be. So that's a good amount of information just at your fingertips right inside the tool. Parameter descriptions, once again, like I said, let's say airflow rate, going with that airflow sensor. So if I want to know what is this PID supposed to be? So it's going to give you, okay, key on engine off, 0 grams per second, key on engine running in a 1 liter, should be 4 to 5 grams per second, etc. It's just going to tell you a bunch of different known goods that it should be. How about like fuel trim, like long-term fuel trim is going to tell you what it should be. It's going to tell you how it works. So a lot of good information in there as well. And you see, it's not every PID, but it's the majority of the PIDs that you'd be dealing with, I guess. Guidelines and procedures. It's going to have like diagnostic services introduction. It's going to tell you what this does, what OBD2 does. If I wanted to check, like, say, what's mode 3, all stored emissions related DTCs identify the signal fault or sensor fault using specific accurate criteria. How about a general mode information and workflow using the first 4 modes, right? So mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, mode 4. And here's how you could go through and use those modes to diagnose a car. And then what is each service mode? I already talked about that. So a lot of information in here. That's just in the troubleshooter. And like I said, you could go into OBD2 training mode and then pop in there under troubleshooter if you wanted to just take the tool and just sit down with it for lunch hour or whatever. You just walk through a few different things, learn a little bit more about how the vehicle works. So we can go walk through that. We have that information. And we have all the mode information. Now, when it comes to, you'll notice that this looks a little bit different than the screenshots. I don't have a mode 5 there. I have additional vehicle information here that I didn't have on the screenshots there. And then, of course, my mode 10 there as well. So next time, in part 2, we're going to start with mode 5 and work our way to mode 10. Because there's a lot more information to talk about in those different modes. We got different test parameters, test results, things like that. Different vehicle information, what you can use that for. So we'll talk all about that in part 2 which will be coming next week at the same time. And with that, that is our time here today. So make sure you tune in for new diagnostic content every week. We will be premiering a new video every Wednesday at 7 p.m. UK time. So make sure you check it out on the YouTube channel. If you're watching, well, of course, you would be watching this on YouTube, but make sure you subscribe, thumbs up, ring the little notification bell so you know anytime we post new content. And it's youtube.com/SnapOnDiagnosticsUK. With that, time for questions. If you have any questions, just feel free. Once again, if you're watching this on a premiere, just leave it in the live chat and we'll answer those. Otherwise, leave a comment under the video and we will get to those as we monitor those comments as well. So I'd like to thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day to learning a little bit more about how you might be able to be more efficient at diagnosing vehicles using some of the information that we've given you today. Hopefully, we'll see you next week. Hopefully you can watch and see you on any of our other videos. Have a good week, have a good night, and take care.